Hi everyone. Do you want to know what happened to the girl who hated books? Let's find out. If you like this story, do consider subscribing. The story is called The Girl Who Hated Books by Manjusha Pawagi. Let me introduce you to Meena, the girl, and Max, the cat. These are the main characters in the story, Meena and Max. Once there was a girl named Meena. She hated to read and she hated books. They're always in the way, she said. This was true because in her house, books were everywhere. Not just on bookshelves and bedside tables, where books usually are, but in all sorts of places where books usually aren't. There were books in dressers and drawers and desks, in closets and cupboards and chests. There were books on the sofa and books on the stairs, books crammed in the fireplace and stacked on the chairs. Did you understand so much? There was a girl called Meena and she hated to read and she hated books. Why did she hate books? She hated books because they were in her way. Why were the books in her way? The books were in her way because she lived in a house where books were kept everywhere, in places where books are usually not kept. Normal people would keep books in bookshelves or bedside tables. But in Meena's house, her parents kept books in places where you don't usually find books. For example, in dressers, dressers means wooden furniture with shelves on top and cupboards below. The parents kept the books in drawers, desks, closets, which were actually meant only for clothes, cupboards, chests. They were kept on the sofa, on the stairs, imagine that. And books were crammed, that means they were forced into the fireplace, even in the fireplace. And they were also stacked, that means arranged untidily on the chairs. They were all over the house. Therefore, Meena hated books and she never read any of them. There she is. So this is what Meena's house looked like. Get the picture? Poor thing. Worse still, her parents were always bringing home more books, as if they didn't have enough. They read at breakfast and lunch and dinner. Please read, they would say to Meena, but she would stamp her foot and shout, I hate books. And when they tried to read aloud to her, she would put her hands over her ears and shout even louder, I hate books. Meena's cat Max hated books too. When he was a little kitten, a thick atlas had fallen on his tail. Ever since then, he tried to stay on top of books rather than below them. So let's see what happened in this part of the story. First of all, Meena did not like books because they were all over her house, like we saw in the first part. They were in places where they were not supposed to be. They were on the stairs, they were on the chairs, they were on the tables. And what was worse than that was that her parents did not stop buying books. Her house was full of books and yet they bought more books. Her parents loved to read. They were avid readers. They read at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know how we sit at breakfast, lunch, and dinner and use our mobile phones? They would read books. So they barely spoke to each other. They just read and read and read. And they would try and make Meena read. They would say, please read. but she would stamp her foot and shout, "I hate books." And when they tried to read to her, she would put her hands over her ears and shout even louder, "I hate books." And now we know that there's another character in the story who also hates books, just like Meena. Who was that? Max, Meena's cat. But he hated books for a different reason. Why did he hate books? He hated books because when he was a baby, when he was a little kitten, he was sitting below a pile of books and a thick atlas. You know what's an atlas? A book of maps. And those books are really thick. And you know how heavy books can be. So if a book is thick and has a lot of pages in it, it will be heavier. That thick atlas had fallen on his tail and he was a baby. You can imagine how much it hurt him. Because of that, he hated books too. And since that day, he always stays on top of books rather than below them. He won't take a chance again. He doesn't want any book to fall on him ever again. And now it is time for me to ask you a question based on the part that we have done so far. Let's see if you can answer it. What was Meena's cat's name? I'm going to give you just 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Your answer should be Max. And I do hope you got it right. Let's continue. Look at that. Her parents are reading, reading and reading and reading. And what is Meena doing? She's shouting, "I hate books." One morning, Meena called Max for breakfast. Who's Max? Remember? He's her cat. But Max didn't come. Where could he be? She wondered. She looked in the bathtub, under the stairs, and on top of the clock. But she didn't find Max. You know, cats have this ability to be just about anywhere. Suddenly, she heard a loud meow. She ran into the dining room, and there he was, stuck on top of the tallest stack of books in the house. We heard before, right, that he would never be down ever since that atlas fell on his tail. And since that day, he always stays on top of the books. So here he was on top of the tallest stack of books in the house. It was made up of all the books her parents kept, like that. Look at Max. It was made up of all the books her parents kept buying her, and she kept refusing to read. At the bottom were big shiny picture books from when she was a baby. She never touched them, she never read them. In the middle were alphabet books and nursery rhymes. Do you think she read those? No. At the top, right by the ceiling, imagine the pile of books, it was almost touching the ceiling. Right by the ceiling were fairy tales and adventure stories which she should have been reading at this age. Did she read them? No. They were all covered in dust. So you can imagine that huge pile starting from the bottom. So when she was a baby, her parents had bought her these picture books. They were right at the bottom. They kept collecting and collecting. When we reach the middle of the pile, we have alphabet books and nursery rhymes from when she was maybe 5 or 6 years old. And now, towards the top of this, right by the ceiling, we have fairy tales and adventure stories. Every single book covered in dust. Who was on top of the pile of books? Max. "Don't worry, Max," Meena called out to him. "I'll rescue you." She stood on a stool. Look at the stool on the right side of your screen. I had to construct that stool. She stood on a stool, stretched forward. Her foot slipped. She lost her balance and started to slide. So, how did that happen? Max was there on top of the pile of books, full of dust. And Meena was standing on the stool and telling Max that she would rescue him. And then she began to slide off the stool. She lost her balance. Crash! The books went flying. They fell every which way. As they fell, strange things began to happen. People and animals started falling out of the pages and tumbling onto the ground. They dropped one on top of the other, scattering the books and toppling the chairs. What happened? Mina fell, and the whole pile of books fell too. They fell all over the place, and then something very strange happened. People and animals started coming out of the books, coming out of the pages. Each book was a story about something in particular. And if it was about a cat, then cats came out of the books. If it was about monkeys, monkeys came out of the books. If it was about a giraffe, then a giraffe came out of the books. If it was about kings and princes and princesses, then they came out of the books. Animals, people, they all came out. They dropped one on top of the other, scattering the books and toppling the chairs. The chairs also fell down. That's how it happened. People emerged from the books. Animals emerged. And then there were princes and princesses, fairies and frogs and a wolf. There were elephants, emperors, emus, and elves, and an assortment of monkeys and rabbits, tangled up in themselves, all mixed up in themselves. Mina sat there, in the middle of it all, too surprised to move. By now, she couldn't recognize the dining room at all. It was horrible. Here's a question for you. Name an Australian bird that cannot fly. You just heard about it. 1, 2, 3. Your answer should be emu. That's an Australian bird. Looks just like an ostrich and it cannot fly. Let's continue. So, what was the room like? The books were lying all over, the animals were all over, all tangled, all mixed up in themselves, plates all over, curtains all over. The elephant was balancing on a coffee table, a small table. There was an elephant on top of it, juggling the good china plates. Imagine, it's juggling, throwing three or more objects in the air, catching them and throwing them again. If you go to a circus, you see jugglers, they have balls in their hands and they keep throwing and catching, throwing and catching. Several, maybe 3 or 5 or 10 of them. The experts can throw and catch more objects than those who are not so professional. So the elephant was doing that. He was balancing on the table, the coffee table, and he was throwing the good china plates. China plates are plates that are breakable. They are made of this, they're white usually, and they're made of this good material that is very delicate. With if you drop it, it will break. The monkeys had torn down the curtains. Monkeys do things like that, isn't it? They had torn down the curtains and were using them as capes. Capes are like coats, but they don't have sleeves. So the monkeys were wearing them, tearing the curtains and putting them around their necks. And the rabbits, what were they doing? They were nibbling on the table legs. They were chewing up the table legs. Imagine the mess in the room. Stop, cried Meena. Go back. But there was so much barking and grunting and thumping going on that no one heard her speak. She grabbed the nearest rabbit and tried to stuff him into a cookbook. Oh no, now that is very bad. It's a cookbook. You can't stuff a rabbit into a cookbook. Why? Look, see why. This is a cookbook. And she tried to put the rabbit into the cookbook. And he screamed, no, you cannot stuff me into a cookbook. Your parents will cook me. He will be part of a recipe then. That's why you can't put a rabbit in a cookbook. It scared him so much that he wiggled out of Meena's grasp and ran away. She opened another book and a flock of birds flew out. She slammed it shut again. This won't work, sighed Meena. I don't know who goes in which book. Now, how would she possibly know who went into which book because she never read them? She thought for a minute. Then she picked up the nearest book and began to read. Now, she had no other option. She had to sort out the mess before her parents got back. So, what was the only thing she could do? She had to find out which creature went into which book. And she had absolutely no idea because she had never read any of those books. So, the only option she was left with was to pick up the books and read them. As she read them, she would find out which creature went where, and then she would be able to return them to their rightful place. Once upon a time, she read, "In a land far, far away." This is how the birds came out of the book. As she began to read, slowly the creatures crept closer and closer to hear what happened next. Soon they were all sitting in a circle around her. When Meena reached the top of the second page, the fairies in the circle jumped up. "That's us," they cried. "That's our page. That's our book. Get in." They leapt out of the circle and dove into her lap and disappeared into the book. So, see, she's succeeding. And how is she succeeding? She's succeeding only because she decided to read. As she read, the fairies came to know that they had to get into the book, and they did so. Meena clapped it shut before they could get out again. Then she picked up another story. One by one, she began reading. All her. And here's another question. Who said, "That's our page, that's our book"? One, two, three, and your answer should be the fairies. I hope you got that right. So, what was happening? Meena was reading. The creatures were sitting around her and listening to her as she read. And as soon as it was time for them to return to a story in a book, they did so. One by one, they all vanished. They all went back into the story where they belonged. Who's left there in the room? Only Meena reading a book. And of course, a lot of mess. One by one, the creatures found out where they belonged. When her parents came in that afternoon, they couldn't believe their eyes. Not because the curtains were gone. Of course, they saw that big mess. They saw the curtains were gone. The dishes were broken. Why? The elephant was juggling them, if you remember. And the table legs were chewed up. Who did that? The rabbits. But they were not surprised with all that mess. What they were surprised with was something else. But because there, sitting in the middle of the room, was Meena. She was reading a book. That was what shocked them. They could not believe that they could see their daughter sitting in the middle of a room reading a book. She had never done that all her life. Remember? Well, I do hope you enjoyed the story. Did you? I'll see you soon, and until then, take care and bye.